As of writing this script, the national debt is just under $20 trillion. It has been a concern for many people for quite some time, but there are some people who assert that the debt doesn't actually exist. There are multiple variations on the arguments asserting this claim, but they all base their conclusion on 2 points. 1, the debt is denominated in US dollars, and 2, the US controls the issuance of US dollars. The logic, or lack thereof, behind this is that the US can create dollars to pay its debts. Needless to say, there are some problems with this logic. Firstly, the ability to quickly pay off a debt doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Your ability to buy more toilet paper doesn't mean that you suddenly have more of it when you run out. Secondly, the ability to do this is not as simple as it is portrayed, and it is not without serious consequences. What is being proposed here is something I mentioned in part 1 called debt monetization. Debt monetization is when the government creates money from nothing and then uses these newly created dollars to pay off its debt. What this has done is add a bunch of new dollars into the economy. When the number of dollars increases, the prices of everything else increases, which in economics is called inflation. The theory behind debt monetization is that it will cause prices to go up, especially for those who are unemployed or underemployed. What really concerns people about debt monetization is hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is when prices go up dramatically in a very short time. Inflation is just the first identifiable issue with debt monetization. There are other issues as well, such as who is creating the money. When we think of money creation, there is a tendency to think of the government printing money, but that's not exactly how it works. What we usually call dollars are actually Federal Reserve notes. The Federal Reserve distributes these into the economy, and every note that is in circulation was borrowed into existence, either by banks or by the government. What this means is that the Federal Reserve has the power to print money, and it can do so out of thin air. Here is one means of debt monetization. The US Treasury can issue bonds for however much money they need, and the Federal Reserve can print however many notes needed to buy that bond. Now, currently, the Federal Reserve is not allowed to buy Treasury bonds directly from the Treasury, but they can buy them in open market operations. And so, this has the same impact as buying them directly from the Treasury, except that it creates the illusion of separation. The Treasury then uses the money to pay its creditors. However, this doesn't actually eliminate the national debt. In order to get the Federal Reserve notes, the Treasury still has to issue bonds that are constitutionally obligated to be repaid. All this would do is reallocate the debt from private individuals, corporations, and foreign governments into the hands of public entities. The debt isn't gone, it's just owned by someone else. The other means of doing this is by minting trillion-dollar coins in the US Mint. In 1996, the US Congress passed a law that would allow the US Mint to make platinum coins with any face value on them. The idea is that the mint could make enough trillion-dollar coins to cover the national debt and then some. These coins would then be given to the Treasury, and then the Treasury would deposit these coins into its bank account at the Federal Reserve. And so, the trillion-dollar coins would never go into regular circulation. This remedy has many of the same problems as the previous one. It still creates inflation. Even if the coins themselves are never circulated, when the US government needs to pay its debts, the coins will be broken up by the Fed and exchanged for physical bills, and then distributed, which will have the same economic impact as borrowing money from the Federal Reserve. However, unlike the option involving the Fed, there are legal hurdles involving the trillion-dollar coins. Although the US Mint has the authority to mint these coins, the federal government wouldn't have the ability to spend them. At some point, Congress passed a mandate on the US Treasury that all spending obligations that cannot be covered by tax revenue must be covered by borrowed money. This measure was put into place to ensure the US didn't devalue the dollar by just printing Treasury notes or minting coins. However, this didn't work. They continued to borrow money from the Federal Reserve, who printed notes that also devalue the dollar. After Nixon suspended the gold standard, Congress kept this mandate in place despite its purpose to protect the US gold standard no longer being a factor. We need to ask ourselves, would abolishing the mandate actually help? In theory, the assertion is correct. Without the mandate, the debt could functionally become zero, but there are consequences to doing this. This would, without a doubt, cause inflation. There would also be market consequences to these actions. If the US decided to print money every time it spent, there would be a dramatic abandonment of the dollar around the world. If Americans wanted to purchase foreign-produced goods or travel abroad, we would have to exchange far more dollars than before, because our currency would be worth less than those of other countries. So, does the national debt exist? Yes, the debt debt does exist. The arguments made do not prove that the debt does not exist, but rather that it can theoretically not matter. However, to suggest that this would have an overall positive outcome is to demonstrate either economic ignorance or a deliberate attempt to mislead. If you'd like to see more videos like this, then you should subscribe to this channel and click the bell icon to be notified when new videos are uploaded. And while you're at it, why don't you go ahead and check out some of the other videos I've curated here. Thanks for watching.